Well, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. How are we all doing today? Hi. My name's Greg. I'm the program coordinator for the Air Museum. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us remotely as well, those of you that are at home in your various locations. Thank you very much. I'm very excited today to announce that our featured speaker today, Dr. Edward Gordon, is physically in the building here from Chicago. So I'll tell you all about him in just a moment, but before we do that, if I could ask everyone to please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, we'll go ahead and get started. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Could I ask all those that have served in uniform to remain standing? The rest may be seated. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for our service. And of course, more thank yous to go around. And I've been saying this every few weeks, and it's been true every single time I've said it. We're getting more and more people here, and that includes our Air Museum volunteers. I'm seeing more and more of people that I call my family here. So to our volunteers, I'm so glad to see you back. Thank you for all that you do. Folks, the Air Museum volunteers are what make this a living history Air Museum. People that have the knowledge and the experience, and they come and they share it with our guests. So how about a hand for our volunteers, folks? They're the ones that do the heavy lifting around here, and I cannot thank them enough. Of course, our membership in the Air Museum. You get to come to programs such as this one with a live and in-person Dr. Edward Gordon. But you also are supporting the Air Museum's mission, which is to preserve, educate, and honor. And we are forever working on new projects. We're very excited to be bringing in an F-117 that is now under our version of restoration. We're bringing it back to make it look like an F-117 again. We've got a Skyfox, and if you don't know what that is, look it up. It's really cool. That'll be coming into the collection very soon as well. So please, if you're here today or you're watching us at home, and you enjoy the Air Museum, you think it's important what it is that we do here, please do consider becoming a member. We would love to have you. If you're here today, we'll take a membership and subtract what you paid for admission and count it toward a membership here. So please do think it over. We'd love to have you. For those of you that are members, and those of you I see year after year that come and say hello to me, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it, and we all appreciate it. So thank you. And now, the thank you to our featured speaker today, Dr. Edward Gordon. As I said, live and in person. We've been doing these remotely for the last few months, but we finally convinced him to come back to the desert. Things are in the red tier here. We're headed the right direction. Dr. Edward Gordon, he's an internationally known historian, speaker, researcher, and author. He has taught history at DePaul University in Chicago. He's presented hundreds of historical programs across the United States at universities, alumni organizations, community groups, trade associations, and on, including museums such as ours now for how many years, I always have to ask. We have to subtract the last year because that one will just say that we're not going to hold it against you. So we're at 19 then?
19 years.
19 years, folks. He's been doing this for us for 19 years. He is the president and founder of Imperial Consulting Corporation, the author of 20 books and hundreds of articles in business and history and education, including his book, his most recent book, which is here for sale today, so you can get a signed copy. And that, of course, is Divided on D-Day, Conflicts and Rivalries That Jeopardized the Allied Victory at Normandy. So please make sure you stick around today and give us some signatures on those books. I know people are going to want those. Of course, you may have seen him on CBS Networks, The Early Show, CNN, PBS NewsHour, National Public Radio, and many, many other media venues. Dr. Edward Gordon has his BA and master's degrees in history from DePaul, and his PhD from Loyola University in Chicago. Here he is, Dr. Edward Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you. You do not know what a pleasure it is to be back here after 2 years. This is the first live program I've been able to do since the COVID epidemic started, or pandemic. And I appreciate you all coming out today. I also do a radio show in Chicago every month on this pandemic. We all know that 500,000 people have died. We probably will pass 600,000 before it is over. Today I'm dedicating this program to David Ramsey. He just died of COVID-19. So I want to dedicate this to his memory, because without his co-authorship, Divide on D-Day would never have happened. Also, this is the first program that I've done since I led a tour group to Normandy in 2019 for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. I want to thank the director of this museum and its board for sponsoring that trip. It was highly successful, and I have high hopes that we will be doing another historical trip to Europe coming up soon. Today we're going to talk about the end of the Second World War and the tremendous controversy that also came with it, with the dropping of the atomic bomb. Fireball in the night, the bombing of Japan. Oops. Well, folks, if the technology will work, there we go. All right. The Japanese Empire, from December of 1941 until the middle of 1942, had spread across the Pacific like a plague. The propaganda of the Japanese government told the people of Japan that they had conquered China, all of Southwest Asia, Australia, Hawaii, and it even invaded the west coast of the United States. Today, our agenda will look at what happened to end this triumph, not only to the military, but also to the people of Japan. We'll look at an early bombing campaign that started in late 45. We'll take a look at how it had changed when General LeMay was brought from Europe. We'll look at the psychology of the Japanese, who intended to defend Fortress Japan like Hitler wanted to defend Festung Europa. And then our plans for invasion, which would have been the largest amphibious assault ever, even much greater than Normandy. And as an alternative to the invasion, how the atomic bomb came about. And once the bombs had started to drop, the struggle that ensued with the empire, between the emperor and his leadership to actually end the war. The surrender itself, how Japan was regenerated under MacArthur's leadership, and then let's talk about the use of the atomic bomb in warfare. Well, here is a map of our offensives in the Pacific. You can see up from the south, across New Guinea, and across the Central Pacific, the United States marched until we were reaching toward the home islands. Some of you just heard my program on Okinawa. 2 years ago, I did Iwo Jima. And the target that we were most interested in was here, the Mariana Islands. And the reason why is with Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, they were now within reach of our brand new miracle warplane, the B-29. Built here in one of the largest factories that built all of the engines, a square mile in size, and the next time you fly into Chicago and if you're flying on Southwest, that's where that airport was covered with a huge factory employing 40,000 people making the engines for the B-29. In fact, I hope to do a program in the future on America's war, what went on in the United States during World War II. Now, those islands are 1,500 miles from Japan, but they were within range. And here is the flight path that the B-29s took. There were 6 airfields built on those islands to accommodate the B-29 bombers. And the B-29s themselves were truly miracle aircraft. If you ever go to England, and I hope to lead a group to England, we'll take a look at the Lancaster bomber sitting next to a B-17. Lancaster is much larger, carries a much bigger bomb load. Well, this plane was even bigger than that. The B-29 was 99 feet long, 27 feet high, and a wingspan of 141 feet. There was one here not too long ago, a few years ago. I don't know if any of you had a chance to go in it or fly in it. It was a monster of an airplane. It had tremendous armament. It could fly at 38,000 feet at over 350 miles per hour and had a range of 3,500 miles and could carry 4 tons of bombs. The first B-29s started bombing Japan in November of 1944. They started using the same tactics that were used in the bombing of Europe. High altitude precision bombing. But it didn't work. It had very little effect on Japan because a lot of the Japanese cities and targets were well spread out and they were not getting the results that they wanted. At the end of 1945, this man, Curtis LeMay, who had been very successful in Europe, was brought in December of 44 to take over and come up with a new strategy. And he had a new strategy. It was going to be low-level bombing, and it was going to be wide dispersal bombing of incendiary with incendiary bombs rather than high explosive bombs. And why was that? Well, here's Tokyo. Now, Tokyo looks like a modern Western city. Well, that picture is very deceptive because most of it at that time was constructed of wood and paper, very inflammatory. So, on March the 9th, 1945, the first major attack using these new ideas against Tokyo began. The B-29s released 609,000 pounds of napalm bombs on Tokyo at an altitude of 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Very dangerous for the bombers and the pilots because of the air turbulence. And of course, the B-29 at that point was a new plane, and really an experimental plane rushed into production. A lot of engine trouble with that aircraft. On March 9th, it was the most destructive, violent night of the entire Second World War in terms of air power in Europe or in Asia. 250,000 buildings in Tokyo were wiped out. 130,000 Japanese died that night, and thousands more were severely injured. 15 square miles of Tokyo were flattened because of massive firestorms. You read about the firestorms or heard about the firestorms that occurred in Hamburg in Germany. And one of the reasons that occurred in Germany was similar to Tokyo. A lot of wooden structures in the old part of Hamburg. That killed 40,000 people in one evening. The U.S. losses on that raid were 14 B-29s shot down and 140 men lost. But Tokyo would be submitted to more and more raids. Here's a picture of what it looked like after the first raid. But the following raids, many more raids on Tokyo. 11.4 square miles were finally destroyed of the city. By August of 45, 1 million of its 1.65 million buildings had been decimated. 250 square miles of the city completely destroyed. Now, from March to August of 1945, this map, which I know you can't read all that fine print, but I just wanted to show you how many cities were attacked. They were firebombed. 66 additional cities were torched by the United States, including Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama. In total, these 67 cities were basically destroyed, and 180 square miles of urban Japan vanished. By July of 1945, right before the end of the war, 50% of Tokyo had been burned to the ground. 300,000 Japanese civilians died in all these firebomb raids across Japan. 20% of the housing of Japan was destroyed. 15 million Japanese were made homeless. Well, what was the Japanese response to this horrendous assault from the air? Well, the Japanese came up with the Tony, a new fighter plane, 366 miles per hour, a ceiling of 33,000 feet, a great new plane far superior to their Zero. However, it was no match to our P-51. You can see one here at the museum. The P-51 had a speed of 445 miles and an altitude ceiling of 41,900 feet. So the Tonys began being shot down by our Mustangs. So what did they do? Well, you can see this right in the picture. They started ramming the B-29s. The Germans tried to do the same thing, by the way. The last ramming of the war occurred in June of 1945. So this occurred almost up to the end of the war. So the question is often asked as to why, specifically, the Tokyo raid of March the 10th produced such a massive slaughter of people like Hamburg, Germany. Well, the answer is multiple. First, as I already have said, the city was largely made out of wood and paper. It was even more inflammatory than Hamburg. Secondly, it was a very dry season in Japan, and there were very strong winds that night. Same had been true in Hamburg. Also, well, the Japanese, of course, called this tremendous wind a kamikaze, the red wind that swept with a hurricane force. And that wind drove up temperatures in the city to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a superheated vapor that advanced ahead of the flame, incapacitating people, and many people died of oxygen deficiency, carbon monoxide poisoning, radiant heat, debris, trampling feet of crowds. These are the same conditions, as I said, that occurred in Hamburg and Dresden. If you go to Dresden today, they have completely rebuilt that whole central city the way it looked before that bombing. It's a beautiful city. I highly recommend Dresden if you ever go to Germany. So Japan was left in ruins. So here are the results of the firebomb of those major cities. The Japanese aerial defenses were often just too few. Too few planes. Their planes were not of higher enough quality and performance to outmatch ours. Too few anti-aircraft guns, too few aircraft shelters, inadequate fire protection programs. Now on the American side, we lost 136 B-29s were shot down. However, 30,000 Air Force personnel who would have died didn't, because what you see here, Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, if you recall the program I did a few years ago, was a funeral pyre for not just the Japanese Army, but also for the U.S. Marine Corps. One of my early mentors, Dr. Joseph Lehman at DePaul University, a professional historian and a British military historian of some note, he said to me he wouldn't go to hell when he died. He had already been there on Iwo Jima. But a lot of men's lives were saved because they could crash land in the ocean around Iwo Jima or on the island itself. In July of 1945, the U.S. blanketed the few remaining Japanese cities that had not been destroyed with these leaflets. It said, "Appeal to the people. As you know, America stands for humanity. It does not wish to injure the innocent people, so you had better evacuate your cities." Well, some did, most didn't. Between January and July 45, the U.S. bombed and destroyed all that was left but 5 cities in Japan, and those were intentionally left intact by the Air Force. Of course, at the same time, what had occurred, we had sunk the Japanese merchant marine, even the coastal shipping around Japan had largely been sunk. And remember, Japan imports everything. Food, oil, everything imaginable. So what was the response by the Japanese government? No surrender. Here is Tojo, the man who started the war, and his cabinet, who authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor, with the idea that the weakling, decadent, immoral Americans, we would sweep them from Hawaii and the Pacific, and they were too weak to ever dislodge us from the fortifications, and the Japanese Empire would control the Pacific. Well, they were forced out of office in July of 1944 after the fall of Saipan, and this is the cabinet that replaced them. Now, some of those cabinet members wanted to end the war, but many of them didn't. Remember, Japan had never lost a war until this time. Never. The chief obstacle toward early surrender to them was that we demanded unconditional surrender. And they could not face the idea that the emperor, who to them was a living god, would no longer rule the country, and that his form of government would not rule Japan. And those fears were amply justified, because many American leaders thought the emperor was the source and the symbol of Japanese militarism, and that they hated and feared. And this fear made the Japanese fight even harder, hoping that the horrendous U.S. casualties that we had incurred on Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and many other of the landings would get us to give them better terms of surrender. So what was their plan? Well, here it is. Ketsugo, decisive battle. The Japanese marshaled considerable military forces on the mainland islands of Japan to stop dead in its tracks any Allied invasion or cause the invasion to have the most horrendous casualties in the history of warfare. The army, almost 2.5 million Japanese soldiers, real trained soldiers and equipped, and 4 million civilian paramilitary. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The Air Force, you think we had shot down and destroyed all the kamikazes? No. 10,000 kamikaze aircraft and the fuel, the gasoline, the supplies to keep them flying. 3,000 conventional aircraft. The Navy still had 19 destroyers, 1 to 300 midget submarines, 5,000 suicide craft. And besides this, the Air Force had 200 takeoff strips in 70 airfields with 24 seaplane bases scattered around the country. In addition, the Japanese had floating bomb deployments ready at 98 secret bases. They had saved food and had released prison guards from frontline duty from all the POW camps, since they were going to kill every one of the POWs. The Japanese had extensive biological warfare that they intended to use. In Manchuria, they had a huge biological warfare plant. They had in Japan 100,000 tons of biological warfare materials, enough to kill half the people in the world. The Japanese had released, as some of you may know, fire balloons in the Japan jet stream to go across the Pacific and start fires in the Pacific Northwest. That was downplayed by the US government as ineffective. It wasn't. There was an entire brigade of US paratroops used as fire jumpers to put out those fires. More insidiously, the Japanese launched thousands of balloons filled with botulism poisoning, to go across the Pacific and start a plague in the United States. Luckily, it didn't work because the balloons went up at such a high altitude, the botulism froze and became inert. So when they crashed, there was no damage. The invasion beaches themselves were interlocked with guns, machine guns, air and sea observation. Poison gas pipes had been laid on every principal beach in Japan, and those gas would be released when we landed. By the summer of 1945, here's Emperor Hirohito looking at the ruins of his cities. He wanted to end the war. Why? Well, first, the people were starving. There was no food. They were eating grass. The civilians in those cities were displaced. The cities basically were totally destroyed. And of course, later, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, he realized that Japan could never defend itself. And he had lost faith in the military. And the people of Japan had finally lost faith because the propaganda obviously was shown to be a tissue of lies. And also, he feared a civilian uprising because the people were starving. He feared they would rise up, destroy him and the government. But the military persisted. Here you see a group of Japanese children digging for uranium because the Japanese were trying to develop their own atomic bomb. Most of the children you see in that picture died of radiation poisoning. Also, the Allied invasion would be met with a whirlwind of Japanese counterattacks. Hourly waves of 300 to 400 kamikazes attacking our shipping and landing. The goal was to sink up to 30% of the 5,000 ships of the invasion fleet. Inland, critical hill networks had tunnels, deep underground rooms, command posts, food, ammo dumps, fresh water supplies. And you know how good the Japanese were at doing these tunnels. From my programs on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, this was even more extensive than on those islands. The Japanese defensive goal was simple: ferocious attacks aimed at killing huge numbers of Allied soldiers and make the cost of blood so high the Allies would seek a better negotiated peace. Japan's goal: fight to the last ditch. Then, in the last ditch, 2 million civilians would go to fight to the death. They were armed with 81,000 rifles, 120,000 bayonets, pipe guns, crossbows, bazookas, automatic weapons, and thousands were given bamboo spears with a knife on the end to attack Americans. So, what were the U.S. invasion plans to take the islands? Well, they were called Operation Downfall. This was the blueprint for the invasion of the home islands. They would establish an air and sea blockade, which they had done. The Japanese Navy basically was finished. We had command of the air. And they would invade and seize the objectives in the industrial heartland of Japan. First, they would take Kyushu in the south, and later Honshu, particularly the Tokyo plain, would be overrun. The first part was the invasion of Kyushu, which would occur on November 1st, 1945, and it was called Operation Olympic. The main beach assault would land 650,000 U.S. ground troops. We were busy transferring troops from Europe across the United States to Japan, to the Japanese area, I should say. And many troops during the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in transit at that point. General Walter Kruger's 6th Army would be spearheaded by the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Marine Divisions. The 1st Air Cav Division would land in the midst of concentrated fire from well-entrenched Japanese defenses. This would be followed by Operation Coronet in March of 1946 that would invade the northern island of Honshu. Oops, sorry. Army and Navy planners in Washington suspected that the conquest would be bloody beyond all expectations. And they studied this in 1944, and this is the conclusion they reached. Here are the casualties. Huge numbers of dead, even larger casualties. And Japanese prisoners of war wiped out, and the Japanese nation basically would be obliterated. The U.S. Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, said war weariness in the United States made a demand to return home those men who had fought in Europe, regardless of the prosecution of the Japanese War. Many Americans were beginning not to want to continue the war. Some military officers wondered whether Japan might somehow be induced to surrender before the scheduled invasion. Enter now the bomb. In October of 1939, the world-renowned scientist Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt. In that letter, he stated that the Germans were developing a device, an atomic bomb. One bomb could destroy an entire city. It was presented to Roosevelt by Alexander Sachs, the director of the Lehman Corporation, a personal friend of Roosevelt. And he told him the story of how Napoleon in 1805 wanted to invade England. Maybe some of you know about that. And of course, that damn English Channel stopped Napoleon just like it stopped Hitler in 1940. Well, Robert Fulton had just invented the steamboat. Fulton came to France, and he showed Napoleon these steamboats, his plans. And he said he would help them build these steamboats, and they could cross the ditch and invade England. Well, Napoleon considered the idea and threw him out as an idiot. Well, Sachs said to Roosevelt, now, the history of the world would have been different if he had listened to this inventor. But Roosevelt got the point. If the atomic bomb was developed by the United States first, before Germany, it might change the course of world history. And so it was. But actually, it took 2 years before they started developing the atomic bomb. Things moved very slowly in Washington. Roosevelt agreed, but then, of course, there was not enough money, and it would have to be a secret government budget. So after, or I should say, before Pearl Harbor, before the war actually started, Roosevelt released emergency money to build the first bomb. It was called the Manhattan Project. And the program would manufacture the key ingredients of that bomb. Now, pictured here are two key people. General Leslie Groves, 46-year-old West Point graduate. He had just finished building the Pentagon. For many years, the largest office building in the world. It isn't anymore. And next to him is Julius Robert Oppenheimer, who was the lead physicist, a brilliant man who would lead the scientists who would create the atomic bomb. Here's a map of all the facilities across the United States that were used to develop that bomb. Oops, see if I get this to. It does not work. Is it working? No, it is not. Up in the top corner, you see in the state of Washington, Richland. That was one of the facilities. Those fire balloons that the Japanese landed next to that facility, it almost destroyed it. Luckily, it didn't get there, because if it had, there might have been a really big explosion. Luckily, it didn't happen. Groves was a remarkable man, and he proceeded to organize this across the country to develop all these key components. 600,000 people worked on developing the atomic bomb. The cost was $2 billion, which would today be $40 billion. Of course, after 1.9 trillion doesn't sound like a whole lot. However, let's put it in relation. Now, you know all those Seabees that built all of those airports, all those runways and facilities in the South Pacific, right? Cost more than the Manhattan Project. December 2nd, 1942, here's Enrico Fermi, this first supervised self-sustaining chain reaction atomic pile at the University of Chicago, where I did some of my graduate work. Very important. And of course, he would be there as an Italian because he was a Jew and he fled Europe. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, huge complex. Their task was to pry highly fissionable U-235 from U-238, the predominant isotope in natural uranium. Here pictured are the women at their stations in the Colatron, where uranium isotopes were separated. Well, Roosevelt and Churchill both knew about the atomic bomb, and they agreed that when the bomb was finally ready, it might perhaps, after due consideration, first be used against the Japanese. This is September of '44. The first two bombs would be named in their honor. Fat Man for Churchill, and Thin Man, later changed to Little Boy for Roosevelt. Well, here is President Harry Truman. He became president, of course, after Roosevelt had a stroke and died in April of 1945. Roosevelt had not told him anything about anything, particularly the atomic bomb. He knew nothing about it. So in June of 1945, he was trying to figure out how to end the war and defeat Japan. Truman asked John McClory, his Assistant Secretary of War, what he should do. And this is what McClory said. He said, well, all that talk of invading Japan struck him as rather, quote, fantastic, unquote. And he said, quote, why don't we use the atomic bomb? Well, that's interesting, but of course the whole argument broke down because they didn't have an atomic bomb. They were still trying to develop an atomic bomb, one that would actually work. So Truman agreed to Operation Downfall, and they went ahead with the plan. Well, here is Los Alamos, remote part of New Mexico. Oppenheimer was trying to develop that bomb. Here's how it looked. Certainly was not paradise on earth. Sort of reminds me of Palm Springs in the summer. Don't take that wrong. No, this was in the 1920s. At Los Alamos, he assembled a stellar group of the world's leading physicists, to assemble all the working parts to produce this bomb. They included also a Soviet spy, who then passed all these secrets on to the Russians, who then developed an exact copy of our bomb in 1949. Well, nearby, it was Trinity Site. Have any of you gone to Trinity Site? Raise your hands, okay. Trinity Site, this is where they tested the first bomb. Now, and here's where they're moving it. Now, that's the container in which the bomb is inside that. It was called at that point the Gadget. Now they didn't know if it would work. In fact, some of them thought there would be this chain reaction and the Earth's atmosphere would be torn off the planet and we'd all die. Now they thought that was 99% not going to happen. But there was a 1% chance it could happen. Here's a tower that was built, a test site to drop and detonate the bomb. So on July the 16th, 1945, the test produced this result. The Los Alamos scientists reacted to this explosion in a variety of ways. Quote, "It looked like a flickering light bulb. The cloud reached the natural clouds in the dawning sky." Quote, "The explosion came to our eyes and to our ears with a tremendous wind." Unquote. Quote, "The land was dark before and now it was lit as strong and as bright as the sun." Unquote. The scientists there held their breath. They yelled. They thought it was awful. They thought it was triumphant. They thought it was beautiful. They thought all of the above. The first bomb blast was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. Everything within the radius of 1 mile from that explosion was vaporized. If dropped in the middle of Manhattan, the island of Manhattan would be, the rubble would be flat as the Kansas plain. Today, when you go to Vegas, don't spend all your time gambling. Go off the strip, and there you will find the the Nevada Test Ground Museum. And there you can see the story of the development of the atomic bomb. They have all of the videos. Hey, I'm one of the kids that was duck and cover, under the desk, right? That would really help, wouldn't it? And that you can go in a bunker, and there you'll see the blast, and then you'll be hit by the backwash of the blast. It's very interesting. And the place is manned by biologists who work at the nuclear test ground site. And once a month, they have a bus, and they'll take you out to the test ground site. So I said to them, well, is this safe to go out there? And they said, there's no problem. Just don't bring a shovel and start digging. So to produce an atomic bomb, the scientists had compressed metals until the close proximity created a surplus of energy, and the energy made this monstrous force. From splitting, from fusion of uranium, they created Little Boy, and from the separating of a new element, plutonium, they made Fat Man. Soon afterwards, 2 bombs were built. Again, Fat Man and Little Boy. 1 bomb each month after that could be produced by the United States, 1 a month. So they had 2 at the beginning. So here now is the B-29, the Enola Gay, that was going to drop the first A-bomb, Little Boy. These are the members of the crew, the 393rd Bombardment Squadron, a section of the 509th Air Force. And there's the crew commanded by a Lieutenant Colonel Tibbett, and he named the Enola Gay after his mother. So Little Boy was a narrow uranium bomb. It weighed 5 tons. Here again is the flight path from where they took off to Tokyo. August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped. An altitude of 1,870, 1/2 pounds of cordite drove into the uranium chunk and produced this flash. 4.5 miles of Hiroshima were flattened. 2/3 of the city wiped out, 59% of the buildings. Hiroshima had a major harbor, had oil refineries, workshops, major military base, armaments, a population of 343,000 people, a garrison of 150,000 troops. Over 78,000 died, another 70,000 were injured. Here is the equivalent of using conventional bombs. So a little boy equated to 20,000 tons of TNT. The temperature reached was that of the sun. So, the Potsdam Declaration was made by the Allies demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan. After Hiroshima, the emperor and his court considered this, his cabinet, I should say. They rejected it. They would not surrender. Of course, the alternative the Allies offered, if you don't surrender, we keep dropping A-bombs on you. The Japanese rejected the ultimatum for 3 reasons. First, they didn't think it was an atomic bomb. They didn't believe we had it, even though we saw the results. 2, we didn't have any more atomic bombs. We couldn't do it again. 3, international opinion would stop us from dropping any more atomic bombs. Now, soon afterwards, the USSR declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, as they had promised that they would do at Yalta. The Japanese were trying to get the Soviets to help them negotiate with the Allies, the other Allies, to end the war. Well, that ended that. So on August the 9th, the second A-bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, a port city in Kuroshima. Fat Man was a plutonium bomb. It was 10 feet, 8 inches long. It had never been tested. They didn't know if it would work. The issue was, did they have enough plutonium to explode the bomb? Well, it did. There's the extent of the damage. 74% of the buildings flattened, 1.5 square miles of Nagasaki wiped out. Population of 250,000, 35,000 were killed, another 60,000 injured. So now, after the second A-bomb blast of Nagasaki, what were the Japanese going to do? August 9th, 1945, at night. Here's the emperor with his cabinet. The cabinet was deadlocked. 3 ministers wanted peace, 3 ministers wanted to continue the war to the bitter end. However, by then, Truman, who still demanded complete surrender, he promised he would continue, quote, a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty of Emperor Hirohito. So he had modified the term slightly. They debated all night. Now you must understand, the Japanese, the emperor was a living god. Literally, not figuratively. At 2, oh, there's Hirohito. Now at 2, we'll go back. At 2 a.m. in the morning, Hirohito broke tradition, and for the first time, he spoke directly to his cabinet. He never did that. He would speak through a court minister that would confer his thoughts to his cabinet. This is what he said. I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing this war can only mean the destruction of our nation and the prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. I swallow my tears and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation. In order that the people know my decision, I request that you prepare an imperial order so that I may broadcast to the nation. This was unprecedented, since the people of Japan had never heard Hirohito speak, ever. Now, though the emperor was right, the emperor was taking a very big risk because the army was quite capable of a coup. In the 20s and 30s, cabinet ministers, prime ministers had been blown up, killed, assassinated, and for the army to take control of the government. Rebellion was at hand. The younger army officers in Tokyo did not care about the atomic bomb. Surrender was worse than the atomic bomb. On August the 9th, 1945, at 7:33 a.m., a Japanese wireless operator broadcast to the US, UK, and China the acceptance of the surrender. 5 days later, on the night of August the 14th, troops of the imperial garrison in Tokyo invaded the palace of Hirohito and took over its grounds. Their intent was to kidnap the emperor and smash the vinyl record, the recording of his speech to the Japanese nation. Here are some of the young colonels that tried this coup. They failed, though. They could not find the emperor, who had been successfully hidden in the palace, and they could not locate the record to destroy it. Early the next morning, their commander, this General Tanaka, came to the palace and ordered all the troops out of the palace, and the officers arrested. He then returned to his office at headquarters and killed himself. So, at 12 noon on August the 15th, the emperor spoke to the people, who were shocked because they had never heard their God speak to them. This is what he said. He told his people, quote, "Should we continue to fight, not only will it result in an ultimate obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it also will lead to total extinction of human civilization. However, it is according to the dictates of time and fate that we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace and for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." There he is reading the speech. Victory, September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day. Imperial Japan's dreams of empire were now at the bottom of Tokyo Bay. Here's one of their battleships. We steamed in 260 Allied ship armada. On the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the Allies gathered for the final surrender of the Japanese. Today, you can go on board the Missouri at Pearl Harbor, and there's a plaque in the exact spot where the Japanese surrendered. And from that deck, you can look and see the Arizona, the graveyard of all those men who died on December 2nd. Historically fascinating to see these two icons of the Second World War preserved. Ceremony was presided over by good old General Douglas MacArthur. He would also command the Allied Occupation Army of Japan, probably the best thing he ever contributed. Pictured here now is the Japanese surrender delegation. Now you'll see the man in the top hat, and I'm afraid your little PowerPoint thing isn't working here. But the guy in the top hat with the cane, he had been the prime minister in the 30s, and he had strenuously resisted the military in their march to war. So they blew him up. He didn't die, he lost a leg. That's why he has a cane. He struggled. He had a very hard time climbing up the side of the Missouri to get to the surrender. But he was the only senior official who would agree to help the emperor and sign the papers, because all the rest would lose face. He was against the war. But he was the one then that was scorned by all the Allies as if he had caused it. He was against it. MacArthur signed for the Allied powers, and pictured behind him is General Wainwright, who had surrendered at Bataan, and behind him, General Percival, who had surrendered at Singapore, the largest surrender in the history of the British Empire, 70,000 Empire soldiers. They both signed for their countries. Now, as an aside, the table used to surrender was from the battleship. The British offered, they had a table used at the Battle of Jutland in World War I, a historic table. But the Allies said, no, we'll just use the mess table from the Admiral's quarters. Unfortunately, the mess table was covered with coffee stains and it's pretty felt, so they arranged the papers of the surrender to cover the coffee stains. As these proceedings closed, thousands of carrier planes, B-29s, flew over this huge fleet of all of this might of the Allied navies and air forces. At this sight, one of the Japanese officers was struck dumb, and he wrote in his diary, "How could Japan have ever conceived of defeating this mighty United States of America?" Remember, we were only in the war for 2 3/4 years, and yet we built all of that material. Could we do it again today? Our high-tech manufacturing lacks the skilled labor within the United States to do it, because the companies won't train, and too many of our young people are so poorly educated they can't operate the computers in advanced manufacturing to build all of that. Here's a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, that was sent to the sailors in the United States Navy. And I want to read a part of it. You can probably read some of it yourself. "You have served in the greatest navy in the world. You have crushed 2 enemy fleets at once, receiving their surrender only 4 months apart. It brought our land-based air power within bombing range of the enemy and set our ground armies on the beachheads of final victory. It performed a multitude of tasks necessary to support these military operations. No other navy at any time has done so much. For your part in these achievements, you deserve to be proud as long as you live." After August 15th, some of the senior Japanese officers refused to surrender. So on August 17th, the emperor signed a second order for them to surrender. And a few isolated outposts and individuals still ignored it. So well aware of these fanatics, the Japanese leader took a further step. They sent members of the imperial family to issue orders to the armed forces to lay down their arms. And these were dispatched to overseas garrisons across the Pacific to get the commanders to comply. Across Japan and Asia, thousands of Allied POWs were at last freed from Allied prison camps and slave labor. In captivity in Europe, about 4% of the Allied prisoners of war died. In captivity, up to 50% of our personnel died in captivity with the Japanese. Many of them worked to death. I will be preparing next year a program on the Nuremberg trials. And I also will have another program on the trials in Tokyo and the trials in the Philippines and elsewhere, and detail to you the atrocities that our men, women endured. And in Europe, the atrocities against civilians, Jews, Catholics, labor leaders, the most murderous regime of the 20th century. Here's a picture. Look at it very carefully. Emperor and MacArthur. It was the first time the emperor had ever been photographed with a commoner, let alone an enemy. It was the beginning of this meeting that the emperor said to MacArthur, I quote him, "I come to you, General MacArthur, to offer myself to the judgment of the powers you represent, as the one who bears sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and action taken by me in the conduct of this war." He went on to tell MacArthur, "Punish me, do not punish my people." This was the first of 10 other meetings that he would have with MacArthur during the occupation. Later, MacArthur, in a memo, basically said that, number one, the emperor is the head of state in accordance with the Constitution that we have drawn up and responsible to the basic will of the people. 2, war is a sovereign right of nations. It is abolished by the Japanese. 3, the feudal system of Japan is ceasing, meaning that there would be no hereditary rights and no other official except an emperor and his family. A new constitution was drawn up by the Japanese, the most liberal guarantee of civil rights, freedom of thought, conscious academic freedom, essential equality of sexes, social security, and the right to work. And political parties were blossomed. From that rose a parliamentary form of government, and Japan became a great world power, but a democratic world power. Now let's turn to the atomic bomb. You know, a careful study of Japan's decision to surrender notes the alternative to not using the A-bomb, a new targeting of the B-29s, of strategic bombing, of rail systems, roads. Of course, already the merchant fleet had ceased to exist. There was already severe food shortages. Millions had already been killed. Without the atomic bombs, of course, the Soviets would have invaded the northern island of Hokkaido. On the Japanese mainland, the Soviets seized about 2.7 million Japanese, a third of the military. The total, around 370,000 Japanese died in Soviet hands. Taking this as a yardstick, the occupation of the northern island of Hokkaido, approximately 400,000 Japanese probably would have died. Now the notion that we could have won by using conventional air power and sea power without either an invasion or a revolutionary new weapon has never been proved nor conclusively disproved. Yet it is hard to see how a long sustained aerial bombing would have led the Japanese military to surrender. It is unclear that without using the atomic bomb, that the emperor himself would have even intervened to provide the first essential step in the process of an organized capitulation. Without that capitulation, it is not clear whether the end of the war would have occurred in 1946, 1947. As we have already seen with Hirohito's support and the 2 atomic bomb attacks, the Japanese military still would not accept surrender and almost succeeded at the 11th hour stopping it. In 2020, the 75th anniversary of the surrender, the Prime Minister of Japan issued no apology for Japan's World War II aggression. The atomic bombs which ended the war against Japan did not cause as material damage nor as many casualties as the previous incendiary bombs. 130,000 people in 1945 in Tokyo had been killed, well over double the total of the 2 atomic bomb blasts. Other raids on Osaka and Kobe had also caused hundreds of thousands to die. And of course, all Allied prisoners of war would have been killed immediately by the Japanese. They had already laid plans, set up the machine guns, and were ready to finish them off. There is another perspective. The infantrymen and the Marines in the United States Armed Forces who were on their way to Japan. I quote one man, Quote, I was a 21-year-old second lieutenant, rifle platoon. Operation Olympic would not, after all, take place. We would not be obliged to run up on the beaches near Tokyo. We were going to live. We were going to grow up to adulthood after all. If the United States had invaded Japan, the operation would have been a long and protracted effort. It would have probably extended the war into 1946. The American public was very anxious to have the war ended. MacArthur, the Army Chief of Staff, once remarked, the American people don't want to fight a 7 years war. The Soviet Union, of course, had declared war on Japan earlier and was prepared to invade the Japanese islands. The world certainly would have led and had a divided Japan, a free South and a communist North. The Berlin Wall might have had a twin wall in Tokyo, suffered for decades like the East German people had suffered. So by surrendering when they did, the Japanese saved the lives of many of their citizens and soldiers that would have been killed. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, would have resulted in horrendous slaughter. We've already looked at these casualties. I'll show you them once again. Recently, I had the opportunity to address an audience with a woman who was a teenager in Hiroshima, attending a high school in a suburb. After the program was over, she got up and made a speech. She said, I had never before known these casualty figures and what the Japanese government was prepared to do to defend my country. I think the lesser horror was dropping the bomb, because if you had invaded, my country would have been totally destroyed. Secretary of War Henry Simpson said that the resort to the nuclear weapons represented the least abhorrent choice before American leaders to end this war. The atomic bomb was awful, but the alternative was much worse. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. has scrapped plans to issue a commemorative stamp of the A-bomb blasts on Japan. Since then, since the end of the war, there have been 2,500 nuclear explosions testing. There are now 15,000 nuclear warheads, over that, known to exist. The lesson of history is this that we must ponder very carefully. Our civilization hangs on the slender thread of man, mutually assured destruction. That awesome fear has kept the nuclear genie in its bottle and prevented the gross immorality of a total, devastating atomic war. Our daily vigilance as citizens of this republic remains to remain strong and to elect officials who will prevent the use of a nuclear catastrophe that would end civilization as we would know it. Thank you very much. Now, I know I ran over a little, but then Greg's long introduction just went on, and it was very embarrassing. Well, we have a mic and questions.
I was going to say, folks, it's been a year since he's done this. Clearly he's rusty. Let's give him a hand, though. Outstanding, Dr. Gordon. Thank you so much. Questions. Anybody with a question today?
Questions, comments?
On the way over? I like to ask questions as I walk with the microphone. How much did the Allies get filled in on the nuclear bomb, the British in particular?
Well, the British were trying to develop a bomb as well. So they, we did share information on the nuclear bomb with them after the war. And of course, the British had a nuclear bomb, as do the French. The French developed it on their own. Yes?
First, Loyola history major. Go Ramblers. Second, when you talk about, as Americans, we mostly are taught history, that it was, a beneficial thing to drop the bomb. We had every reason to do it. what was the international reaction immediately after we did it?
I would say immediately afterwards, the international reaction was they were very happy that the Second World War was over. That 50 million people had died in the Second World War. All right. Now there were scientists, including Oppenheimer, who wanted to prohibit the use of the bomb forever. All right. And the difficulty is, of course, the Soviets got the bomb in 49, they got a hydrogen bomb in 51, and as I said, that mutual assured destruction is the only thing that has stopped them from using it, or us as well. The United States is not going to take presumptive strike against anybody. All right? And we have safeguards built into the systems so that you're not going to have some crazy general or colonel on his own ordering a nuclear attack. Even if you've seen Fail-Safe and some of those movies, I assure you that that is not going to happen. And even if a president of the United States ordered an attack and it was shown that he himself was not quite with it, it wouldn't happen. I'll tell you that much right now.
Another one over here, Dr. Gordon?
Yes. Where are we? Oh, way back, way in the back. Okay, yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the presentation. It was extremely informative. You mentioned how the military, the Japanese military, was very much against the surrender.
Yes.
How was the civilian populace? How did they take that? Was there relief or was there that?
There was relief. There was great relief. There was shame they had lost the war, but again, they were starving, many had died, their homes were destroyed, etc. And they accepted the emperor's judgment. Remember, the emperor was a living god. He was not the president. He was a living god. All right, there's a difference in their thinking about this. So they were happy the war was over. They were not happy with they were afraid of the occupation. They had been told the Americans would kill, rape, murder all of them. That's not what happened. We rebuilt Japan as we rebuilt Europe. Remember the Marshall Plan. The greatest thing we ever did. The biggest mistake we ever made is when the communism fell in Russia, we didn't have a Marshall Plan for Russia so that we didn't end up with a Putin. We did it in the 40s. Why didn't we do it again? Instead of just selling them luxury goods, we should have rebuilt and helped them form a real economy. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. I just want to make a comment. My stepfather was in the Army, and he was actually being prepared for the invasion of Japan.
Right.
And after the bombs were dropped, I think just a couple months later, he was discharged because we didn't need all these extra soldiers that would have been sacrificed for the invasion.
Yes.
And he was from Chicago, as am I, so welcome.
Okay, very good. All right. And of course, all that military equipment that we built, a lot of it, we just dumped it into the ocean. A lot of it. And of course, the Second World War brought about tremendous developments in computers, airplane technologies, and many other fields. War is a two-edged sword. In fact, I'm developing a program on the effects of war. Why are people always so fascinated with war? Why are people always so fascinated with my programs on Adolf Hitler? I could do a program on the Pope. I don't think I get as many people. But I talk about Hitler, I get a huge audience. All right. So I may be doing that in the future. Any other questions? Well, next year, God willing, and the germs going somewhere down the drain, I'll be back with more programs on Nuremberg, the Tokyo trials, and Hitler and the birth of modern propaganda. Thank you today for coming. It was very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Opportunity today to pick up a book, Divided on D-Day, the controversy there between the leading principles and the D-Day invasion. Jason over here at the desk has got it for sale. an opportunity today to get them signed. If you don't already have a copy, my goodness, get one today. Thank you so much. Enjoy your time with us. The museum is open. The gift shop is open. The cafe is open. Thank you for being here.
Elaine, would you pick up them? Okay, now I'm gonna go over here and sign books. So all of you guys come over here, and I'm gonna sit down and we can sign books and talk.